Welcome to the ninth class on the book of Revelation, and tonight we go to chapter 6. This is one of the more famous passages in the book of Revelation. Many people, when they think of Revelation, they think of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Some use the four horsemen of the apocalypse to actually represent the book of Revelation. So when you think of images, and you think of what epitomizes the book of Revelation, well, you think the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Let's review what we talked about last time. In the last two classes, we looked at Revelation 4 and Revelation 5. John was invited to heaven. He goes up. He sees some strange, fantastic images. We see that all of heaven is worshiping God as creator. We are introduced to this lamb, a lamb who was slain, but he is standing at the same time. We're told he's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Then we turn around and find he's actually a slain lamb that's actually still standing. So we get this sacrificial picture of Jesus' death on the cross for us, but also his resurrection, that he's still standing. So the heavenly worship focuses on God as creator and also as the Lamb as redeemer. And there is this scroll that the Father is holding on the throne. And this scroll is written on front and back, and there's 7 seals, and no one is worthy to break the seals on the scroll. And so John weeps bitterly because of this. And then someone says, listen, the Lion of the tribe of Judah is able to break the seal. So today, in our class, we get to see the breaking of the seal. So finally, we get to see what's in the scroll. So I would say Revelation kicks into high gear at this point. Now we are getting God's plan of redemption. So we're going to just launch into chapter 6 this time and talk about this scroll. And what is this scroll all about? Well, there's judgment to come. It's not very popular these days to talk about judgment. We think it may be out of tune with the message of Jesus. Like, how in the world could Jesus say things like in Luke 23:34? He's on the cross. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. As they cast lots and they're dividing up his garments among themselves. So Jesus from the cross is saying, listen, forgive them, Father, they don't know what they're doing. So how do we reconcile this violent language in the apocalypse to the forgiving message of Jesus Christ? Is there a conflict? Well, I don't think so. In the passages concerning the opening of seals and trumpets and bowls, we witness God's judgment and his condemnation against the unbelieving world. So God's going to come and judge those who have oppressed and persecuted his people. The church, and before that, Israel had been a part of a lot of regimes that tried to oppress and destroy God's people and destroy God's message. I mean, Israel's history is replete with many nation states that tried to destroy them. We know right before Jesus was born, well, a few hundred years before Jesus was born, but in the Intertestament period, Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greek kingdom tried to stamp out Judaism, and they came close to doing it. And the Jewish people fought back in what's called the Maccabean Revolt. So history has all kinds of examples where people have tried to persecute God's people. And so in this, we get this picture of judgment to come. Now, what's really cool that you're going to see in the coming parts of the book of Revelation, starting in chapter 6, we're going to see 7 seals. We're going to have 3 sets of 7. We're going to have 7 seals. We're going to have 7 trumpets. And we're going to have 7 bowls that are poured out upon the earth. Now, some have said throughout the years that each one of those 7 are like successive events in the history of mankind. So you get through, you're kind of marching through history. So let's say the first seal starts in the 1st century. So you go through the 7 seals and you're marching through real space-time history. Then you get to the 7 trumpets, and then you're moving further into history. And then as you get to the 7 bowls, you're moving even further to history until you get to the end of the world. I don't think that's the case at all, because that's now not how John was writing. This is a recapitulation, and this happens a lot in biblical studies. You'll notice it's kind of like nested eggs. When you get to the 7th seal, at that 7th seal, you get the revelation of the 7 trumpets. Then when you get to the end with the 7th trumpet, you get the revelation of the 7 bowls. It's like nested eggs. And so you're getting a cycle of 7 that repeats itself. You're just getting a different picture of the same judgment. So this judgment is going to be inaugurated maybe in the time of John, I would think. And you're going to see 3 different pictures of that same judgment that starts in the time of John. Now, when it finishes, that's up for debate. But you're going to get these 3 sets of 7. So as we see the 7 seals, okay, so we get a picture of God's judgment, a snapshot in apocalyptic language. Then we get the 7 trumpets. We get the same segment of God's judgment just from a different perspective. Then we get the 7 bowls, and once again we get the same judgment through a different set of eyes. So maybe that'll make sense to you, I hope. So John's situation, what's happening on the ground when this happens? We've already said this, and I don't want you to get tired of hearing the same old, same old. John is in the midst of persecution and tribulation when he writes this book. And the book begins with John's suffering. And he's addressing the suffering of Christians at large across the world. And so this would follow through the experience of Israel through the ages. One cannot help but feel the anguish of Israel when we read passages like Psalm 35, Psalm 55, Psalm 69, Psalm 109, Psalm 137. You get the anguish of God's people through the ages. When we read a psalm like the 55th Psalm, you can feel the cry for righteous judgment. The people of God are crying out for justice. We all want justice. Now, one reason I think we in America have a problem with this is in some sense, there are segments of our population that have had it really good. Now, some have not. Some have not at all had it really good, and some have felt the sense of being oppressed, or, and that's an overused word these days, but the sense of being on the underside of power, and the sense of being helpless, the sense of being treated unjustly by other people. And when you're treated that way, you cry out for justice. You want someone to come and set it right. And that someone who can set it right is God. And so the early Christians are crying for God's justice. There is nothing wrong with that. When you read the imprecatory Psalms, these Psalms that cry out to want God to intervene, there's nothing wrong with wanting God to make things right. So this time in the history of the world is racked with a lot of uncertainty. And I would say we have to be careful with this because history is always racked with uncertainty. I mean, think if you lived in the early part of the 20th century. If you lived in the early part of the 20th century, just in the United States, you went through a world war like no one had ever seen before. I mean, you could back it up and go to the Civil War, and you saw a conflict like people have not seen before. You saw killing on an industrial level, like with industrial weapons, still fighting with old tactics. You saw a slaughter that was just really unimaginable in the Civil War. And then not long after that, really, a generation and a half later, you're fighting a world war. Then you're going through a Great Depression. Then you're going through World War II, which was much worse than World War I. So you would look at that and go, man, that's a rough time to live through. So history has these cycles where things are really bad at times. So we need to be careful with this apocalyptic viewpoint where we start saying, man, coronavirus and racial unrest and economic woes and China, and we could name all these different things going on and go, man, it's the end of the world. Well, it's been jacked up since probably very early in the beginning of creation when sin came on the scene. But in the first century, just let me lay out some things going on for them. First, you've got earthquakes that happen around 60 AD that really, really rock Asia Minor. You've got the persecution of Nero in 64 AD. Then you have the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD that will change everything for the Jewish people. You realize when the temple was destroyed, the Jews were outlawed from Jerusalem. They couldn't even live in Jerusalem anymore. They put a pagan temple where the Jerusalem temple had stood. I mean, their world changed in 70 AD. So in 60, 64, and 70, you had 3 things literally that changed the landscape of their world. Catastrophic things that Christians going through that would be scratching their head going, man, this is nuts. Now, let's just play devil's advocate. Let's say people are right that say Revelation was written later. Let's say Revelation was written in 96 AD. I may be wrong about that, and I've said that already. I could be very wrong. Well, you can add to the current events, if John's writing this in 96 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupts in 79, and then there is a horrible grain famine in 92 AD. So you've got earthquakes, systematic persecution, destruction of Jerusalem, which we can't even wrap our mind around that one. You've got the eruption of Vesuvius and Pompeii and all that, and you've got the grain famine of 92. So a lot of things are going on for these Christians that would really be shaking them up, plus they're being persecuted on top of that. There was this ancient Jewish belief. Now let's just think about sin, chaos, destruction, and judgment, okay? How did Jewish people see all this? And this is important to understand Revelation. In ancient Jewish thought, there was a belief that sin brought about chaos, and that is true. It's not really an ancient belief. It's actually a Christian belief too. They believed that at creation, God ordered the chaotic waters and the spiritual beast that would bring chaos on the earth. That would be the demonic, would bring order to those entities. They also believed that this chaos was held at bay at the four corners of the world. Now we know there are no four corners, but think of it metaphorically. And trust me, ancient people could think metaphorically better than we can. So at the four corners, the angelic held all these things in check, but at any time, all that could come unraveled and all this chaos would break up on the earth. So that is in the mindset of ancient people. It was during the time of Noah, think about it, that the chaos took back over. God allowed this chaos to come back up on the earth, and so you get decreation. Remember, in the creation account, God separates the land from the water. God brings order from the primordial chaos. In the great flood, you've actually got disorder again. You've got decreation. The water's coming back up on the land and covering the creation again. So that's an interesting way to think about it. Now, I want you to think as you're reading through this, if you like to read the Bible and look at similarities, I really would like to go back and do a video class on Matthew 24. If I have time to do that, I'll add that to these classes so you'll have it. I could try to do that. I know we did this in class live here at Westgate. We looked at Matthew 24, which is very troublesome for a lot of people to interpret. There's a lot of similarity in Revelation 6 and Matthew 24. First of all, there's war and unrest. There's conquest. There's, you could call it civil unrest in both of those. You've got international strife in both of these. You've got famine in both of these chapters. You've got pestilence in both of these chapters. You have persecution in both of these chapters. And you have earthquakes and decreation in both of these chapters. And it's it's hard just to call that a coincidence, that there's some type of structural similarity between Matthew 24 and Revelation 6. Now remember, Matthew 24 is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's why some scholars will jump and go, Revelation 6 could be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And I haven't completely ruled that out myself. That could be a viable option, that this is God's judgment on Jerusalem. And what I'm about to say is not anti-Semitic. Okay, John was a Jew. A lot of early Christians were Jews too. So please don't take this as an indictment on all Jewish people. It's not the case at all. My favorite Bible character was as Jewish as you can get, the Apostle Paul. I mean, of course, the Lord Jesus Christ is my favorite, but my favorite Christian teacher is Paul, and he is the Jew of all Jews. But anyway, there was judgment on the Jewish nation who had rejected their Messiah. So God comes in judgment on Jerusalem, and the temple is destroyed, and it is total destruction. So it would make sense that Revelation 6 could be talking about that if John wrote it before AD 70. The seven seals, I wanted to put a chart up here that I had in my notes from teaching a class before. What's really cool, I told you there's 3 sets of 7, right? There's the 7 seals, there's the 7 trumpets, and there's the 7 bowls. In these sets of 7, there's a 4-3 progression. Now, for you football guys, I'm not talking about the 4-3 defense, a 4-3 progression. There are 4 seals, okay? And then there is this like intermission that happens between the 4th and the 5th seal. And then you go into this next set of 3. The same thing happens with the trumpets and the bowls too. You're going to notice this 4-3 progression. So John, I'm not completely sure what's going on there, but it's there. There's the structure of 4, intermission, then the 3 come. And he does it with with the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. So there's something to that, something to think about there as you read through this book. Now, the 7 seals and the horsemen. Let's think about that. The 7 seals are broken up into groups of 4 and 3. The trumpets in chapter 8 and 9 and the bowls follow the same pattern. I've told you that. The background of these horsemen could be Zechariah. If you go back and look at Zechariah talks about these four horsemen. I believe he brings them out in chapter 1, and then you read more about it in Zechariah chapter 6. But the four horsemen of Zechariah are sent out to patrol the world to bring judgment on those people who have oppressed God's people. So in a Jewish framework, if you're John's audience, whenever he brings something into the prophecy, into Revelation, he wants you to go back to the Old Testament and look at where it comes from. And so if you're thinking four horsemen, you're thinking Zechariah, and his four horsemen were all about judgment of the nation. So I believe these four horsemen represent some type of judgment upon people that oppress God's people. There's only one problem with one of the horsemen, and I'll explain it to you in a minute, where that theory is kind of tenuous a little bit. Let's look at Revelation 6, 1 through 2. Now, I've said a lot in introduction, probably the introduction that put you to sleep. But let's look at the passage really quick. Now, I watched when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And he came out conquering to conquer. So just a fantastic image when you think about it. You've got this, the Lamb now who is worthy, is breaking the seal. So he breaks one of the seven seals. And those four weird living creatures say to John, "Hey, come over here." And so he looks, and then I don't know how he sees it. I mean, I've always wondered what it was like for John. Does he see like this misty fog, and all of a sudden this rider is riding closer to him, and he starts to see it, and it starts to materialize? Let's think about what we see. We see a white horse. We see, of course, there's a rider on the horse, bow and a crown, and there's conquering. So let's think about what that could be. Well, we know Jesus is worthy to open the seals. We know that. And we are starting to see the witnessing of God's perfect plan. And we know this plan is very detailed because this scroll is written on front and back. So this is a complete plan that God's got for his people. We're going to get this story. How is it going to unravel? How will history unravel? How is God's plan going to be carried out? So the horse is a symbol we find throughout the Old Testament. Okay, it's everywhere in the Old Testament. Zechariah 1, 8 and 10, we get introduced to these four horsemen. Like I said earlier, Zechariah 6, 1 through 8 fleshes it out. They're patrolling the earth. The horse represents swift action in God's mission. So here, I'm going to give you one interpretation, okay? And this is one that you find across the board with a lot of commentators because there's a lot of reasons to believe this. This could be Christ and the victory of the gospel. Psalm 45 talks about this Davidic king who has these arrows that are part of his arsenal, and they're sharp, and people fall under him. And there's this conquering king. And so Jesus is the conquering king. The white always represents goodness. We'll see later, I think in Revelation 19, Jesus will come back and have almost the same image of being on a white horse. He has a Stephanos. A Stephanos is a victory crown that a triumphal general would wear. You think of maybe Julius Caesar coming back into Rome in triumphal procession wearing a Stephanos crown. So Christ works through us, his people. So this would be the victory of the church. Now, don't get too triumphant yet in your thinking, because this victory of the church will come through sacrifice. It's not going to be easy. So we have these warriors for peace. We have these warriors with the gospel going out with the gospel of peace, being triumphant in the world. Paul said of Jesus in Ephesians 2:17 that he came and preached peace to you who are far off and peace to them who are nigh. Now, there are alternative explanations to the first horseman is. Let me give you the second most common explanation for what this first horseman could be. So other scholars, if you go down and look at commentaries, a lot of times the number one explanation would be, okay, the horseman is Jesus. Then here's the second. The second one is, if you want to roll with all the four horsemen are negative and they represent God's judgment or negative or bad things, then you don't need to make the first horseman Jesus, because that's a good thing. That's an ultimate good. This first horseman possibly could be false religion. And the reason it would be a white horse is it appears to be religious, pure, and good. But it's this false deception that goes out. And some would go back to Matthew 24:11, when Jesus says that false prophets will go out. They'll arise and lead many people away. And it's true. In the first century, there were a lot of bad actors. There were a lot of false prophets and false teachers that led people astray. So that was common in the first century. That was nothing weird. And we know that happened for a fact. You can read Josephus and other sources and know there are false messiahs after Jesus came. Let's look at the next seal and meet the next horseman. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people could slay one another. And he was given a great sword. I can't help but think of the red horse in Mars, the god of war, in mythology, but this red of blood when you think of it. So let's think of this rider. Okay, we've got a red horse. Of course, this is the second seal. Red horse, bright red, okay? He's going to take peace from the earth, so we're going to see war coming, okay? So that people would slay one another. So this could be like civil conflict, civil disorder, where citizen against citizen. And there's a great sword given to him, a great sword. So you're going to have people taking each other's lives. The word for slay here is sphato. Now, sphato is a word used many times for the death of Christ. Sphato is the word used for the Lamb in Revelation 5:6. It's used of the dead saints under the altar that we're going to meet in just a minute. Well, actually, we'll meet them in the next class. The dead saints under the altar of the Lord. Their lives were slaughtered. They were slain for their faith. The word in this passage for sword is makaria. And makaria is the word for the Roman short sword, like in the infantry. So when you saw a regular Roman soldier with a short sword, and they were very effective with these, the makaria would be what this is called. It's the word Jesus uses in Matthew 10:34 when he states, "Think not that I came to bring peace on the earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword, a makaria." It's the same word he uses there. So this sword that Jesus referred to would lead to bloodshed and persecution. So let's just think through what this could be for just a minute. And let's start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, okay? We've got red, people killing each other, civil disorder. We've got sacrificial language, sphato. We've got the makaria sword. Most people think, okay, number one, civil strife. That's easy, okay? It's a time of civil strife, but also a time of persecution, God's people. So let's just go with what I think the first horseman is. The gospel is going to go out in victory. There's going to be pushback. So as the gospel goes out to conquer and bring peace, the darkness doesn't like the light, and the darkness rises up against the light, and so we have this bloodshed. So strife, like Jesus said, I came to bring a sword, not peace. So there is this strife that the gospel brings about. In the book of Acts, it says Christians are these people that are turning the world upside down. Josephus also, now if you want to go back and talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, could this be referring to world events that are leading up to AD 70? We know that right before the temple was destroyed, the Romans and the Syrians and the Jews, there was a lot of civil strife between those three groups. Let's go to the third seal. When he opened the third seal, I heard the living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse. And its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine." Now, this fourth black horse, let's just think, kind of visualize the image, right? The horseman is wearing or has scales in his hands. And we have some weird statement about a quart of wheat for a denarius. So food's going to cost a certain amount, right? The price of food. And there's going to be 3 quarts of barley for denarius. So wheat must be more expensive than barley, obviously. You get more barley for denarius. And it's something about not harming the oil and the wine. So honestly, what do you think is going on here? When you look at this, what calamity is coming up on the earth? Well, a shortage of basic means and price inflation. That's what's happening here. A quart of wheat would be enough for one person for an entire day. So 1 quart of wheat would feed you for 1 day. A denarius was 1 day's wage for the common person. Imagine living in a situation where inflation was so bad. It was so bad it would take a whole day's wage just to feed you. So you're working an entire day just to eat and keep from starving. Barley was much cheaper and would be used by poor families to feed everyone. So let's say you're a father of 3 children. Well, you would buy barley for denarius to feed your 3 kids, and you still wouldn't have enough to eat. Oil and wine were more luxurious items, and you couldn't afford them on a meager wage. Oil and wine were very common in the ancient world to use for so many different things. So this is a time of financial hardship. Now, I would recommend to you the studies by Nelson Craybill. I'm not like a big fan of everything Craybill does, so I would say wade into that with caution. But Craybill has some other, I don't know how to put it nicely, ideas that are out there, kind of variant to what I would consider to be orthodox scholarship in some ways. But you've got this economic persecution of the church. So this could be a famine. Yes, I think there's a famine possibly. But for Christians, they would live in a famine situation because of their faith. They would lose their jobs. They would be locked out of trade guilds. They would actually be locked out of some marketplaces, imperial marketplaces. Some believe when you would go into the imperial marketplace, you would have to bow to the image of Caesar, which John's going to call the beast. And if you don't do that, you can't go in the marketplace. So imagine if you're a Christian, you can't go to Target, right? Some of you may remember Christians were boycotting Target at some point in the past. Imagine if you were told, imagine if there was such a pagan situation in Walmart or Target that you couldn't even go in there and buy stuff. Imagine if you get to Walmart and they have the greeters sitting outside and they're going, okay, before you guys can go in, we want you to pay homage to Muhammad. You must say Muhammad is the only true prophet of God, and he is Allah's prophet, and there's only one God, and his name is Allah. And of course, as a Christian, you go, I can't do that. Well, then you couldn't go in Walmart. Well, that would be a similar situation for Christians on the ground in Asia Minor in the first century. They can't go in the agora because of their faith. And that's one theory. We don't know that for sure, but that's a theory of what was happening to Christians. So that gives you some perspective. I really think this could be about financial persecution, but honestly, I think when you look at it really hard, this is probably some type of famine where there's a shortage of food to eat and price inflation, which this happened in the Roman Empire. The balance, and what adds to this theory of financial hardship is the balance or the scale would represent famine or shortage. Now, some argue this is a seasonal famine, and this may be going too far, but I just want to give you this theory. You may hear this if you like to read commentaries. Some think it's seasonal because the time of the year for wheat would be spring at Pentecost. So the wheat would be harvested at Pentecost, and oil and wine, those particular items would be harvested and pressed and processed later during the Feast of Booths. So think later, maybe going into the fall. You'd have the second harvest. So this shortage of food would happen earlier in the year, and then later in the year, things would get better. That's really reading into the passage, really. And there's some difficulty with that, but I always like to just throw those out there for you if you like deeper study and like to be devil's advocate and think through these things. There you go. There's your nugget of knowledge for the night. Let's go to our fourth seal, and this will be the last one we look at tonight. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and with wild beasts of the earth. Do you notice that this last horseman really encapsulates all that you've seen so far? I mean, this is a pretty bad mamma jamma. This is death in Hades. This is not a good image. This is not the horseman you want to see coming. You've probably seen artwork of the skeletal rider on this beastly looking horse that people will put out in popular culture. Maybe you like comic books. I think there's a Christian comic book writer called Kingstone Comics, and they, if you like this if you're kind of a comic nerd, but they draw pictures of these horsemen that'll scare the snot out of you when you look at them. But I can just imagine John seeing these horsemen, and I don't know why I see them coming through fog, but they're coming through fog and clouds, and they're coming closer and closer. And maybe they ride by him and he watches them go by. I don't know. That's kind of how I envision what's happening here in the visions. But what is this all about? Well, I don't want to gross you out, but the color of this horse is chloros in Greek. And that word probably sounds familiar to you because it's where we get the word chlorophyll from. Chlorophyll. Now, this would be something dead and bloated and nasty, and it's turned so putrid, the dead body of whatever we're talking about, it's turning green. Maybe you've seen people turn green before they get sick. That kind of color, a pallor that's just really sickening to look at. So this pale green color, a sickly color. Some look at that and say this could represent disease, some type of epidemic, pandemic of some kind, possibly. We don't know for sure. Death and Hades. This is the worst of all, right? We don't really know why the horseman has power over 1/4 of the earth, but we know that. And you can read the arguments ad nauseum and waste a lot of time of your life trying to listen to the arguments why it's 1/4, and none of them are really good. So I didn't give you an explanation because I don't think there's a really good explanation as to why it's 1/4. Some see in the horseman a culmination of all that came before, and I've already said that, and I think that's true. The sword used to kill in this passage is the Thracian sword, the rhomphaea. And this is a large two-edged sword, and it's not the sacrificial Macaria used by the Red Riders. It's different, okay? God kills by sword, famine, and pestilence, and the wild beasts of the earth. So you've got this total death, sword, famine, pestilence, wild beast. And this makes you think of great wars whenever you think of those scenes where a city is so decimated by war that the wild beasts roam the city after the war is over. And so the citizenry after war, not only is it just the bloodshed from the conflict, but then they have to deal with the famine after, and then they have to deal with pestilence and disease after the war. And then it even gets worse where wild animals roam and terrorize people. And this is all throughout history. You see these pictures that are very similar, this progression of war, famine, pestilence, and then animals take over the city. Rome, when it was sacked by the Germanic tribes later in the 4th and 5th century, wild animals roamed the streets of Rome. And Ezekiel talks about this fourfold scourge that I think that maybe John borrows from in Ezekiel 5. You can look at that if you want. There's also in Ezekiel 14. I just want to give you a picture. This is one artist rendition. There's some crazy ones out there if you look them up. If you Google Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, you'll see some crazy stuff. But here's the first horseman. He's got if you look at the white horse, he's got the bow, the arrow, he has the crown. Then you have the red horse who's bringing warfare, and there's a Roman soldier on it, which I think this is a more accurate depiction maybe of what John saw. There's a Roman soldier with the Macaria sword drawn, and he's going out. And then you have the black horse, where the person is kind of dressed like a person maybe that came out of a famine. They're missing some clothes there, but he's holding that scale to show us that there is a shortage of goods. And then you've got I wish this horse was a little bit more green, but this pale horse with a skeleton, which I guess is supposed to be this scary Death and Hades figure riding on the scene. Not to be silly here, but here they go, riding through the clouds across, and that'll be just a picture for you to take in, maybe a visual image of these four horsemen. So let's just sum up what we've learned today. I want to just take one class to talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, because they're such a part of Western imagination. We've heard them so much. I mean, even in football, we've talked about the four horsemen before, speaking of a group of players. But we see that things in the book of Revelation have escalated, right? I mean, we've got this vision in heaven. Well, let's go back. We had the letters to the churches. We had the vision of heaven. And now the seals are being broken, and things are getting crazy. Things are escalating. So this book's picking up speed, and we're going to see some really fantastic things in this book. The Lamb is unveiling God's plan. Each horseman reveals another aspect of God's plan. So here are some possible ways to see each factor in this plan. Let's just think together for a minute as we bring all this to a close. It could be false religious deceptions, okay? Number one, that's one possibility. I tend to think this could be the gospel going out, number one, the first horseman, the gospel going out, and being successful in the world. And then in reaction to the gospel going out, you've got persecution and strife. You've got next famine and inflation. And then fourth, death and the totality of all the other calamities that have come thus far. So not a very uplifting picture tonight. Boy, we in 2020 right now do need some good news. As we think about the things going on in our own country right now, it feels like we're ripping apart at the seams, and I guess the book of Revelation is timely for us too. We need to realize that other people have suffered too, more than we have. That's not to belittle the pain and suffering going on around the country. There's people that have died, people that have suffered injustice that I can't imagine. There's people that are without jobs right now. There are people that basically their life is falling apart. And they're crying out to God for help. They're crying out to God for his judgment. And what Revelation is going to tell us, even though it's hard for us to see it, is that the Lamb is on the throne, and God is in control, and he is sovereign, and he will put this world right. We may not get it in our lifetime, and I think we got to understand that. I'm not saying don't stand up against injustice and problems, but we're not going to create utopia here on earth. It's not going to happen. If we don't accept the idea of the fall, we have a common humanity. We are made in God's image, number one. Number two, we have a common condition of sin, and that gives us solidarity. I don't care if you're black, you're white, you're Chinese. It doesn't matter where you come from. We have a common solidarity that we're made in God's image, but we also have to understand that we're all sinful. We all have that same story, and that binds us together. And we better come to grips with that really quick as a people, or this country will disintegrate and fall apart. So the answer to me is in Scripture. The answer is found right here in the book of Revelation. God's on the throne. His judgment is just. Those people that have perpetrated evil will be brought to ultimate justice with God. And that will be a rough day. The Bible does say that. It's not for the light of heart, the judgment of God. He will make everything right, and we can find peace in that tonight. So I hope this lesson has helped you. I hope now you understand the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and they're not such a mystery to you anymore. I look forward to us coming back next time. We'll finish chapter 6. We'll meet these people that have been persecuted. It's going to be fascinating. So I would encourage you to share this with your friends and invite them to come along with these next studies, because it's about to get really interesting in the book of Revelation. We got the rest of the summer to get this series finished up. We'll get it done. Hopefully by the fall we'll be done with these, I pray. And if you're rolling with me, you'll have a good picture of this book, and it won't be so difficult to understand anymore. God bless, and I'll see you back with our next class.